Welcome back to Telltale Books. Back to my James Tiptree series. I want to talk about Tiptree's, is her eighth? Yeah, it's her eighth published work, titled Your Haploid Heart. Your Haploid Heart was published in September of 1969 in Analog magazine, which I happen to have a copy of that issue right with me here. There's lights catching it, maybe a little closer. It's the cover story of this issue. So the cover illustration goes with the story Your Haploid Heart, and it's a beautiful illustration by Frank Kelly Fraze. I think it's one of my favorite illustrations that he's done. And now I also happen to have this in The World's Best Science Fiction of 1970, edited by Donald A. Wollheim and Terry Carr, published by Ace Books. This is the Science Fiction Book Club hardcover. I also do have the paperback edition of this. I bought the paperback of The World's Best Science Fiction as a used book way back in 1978. Maybe it was even in late 1977. It was when I first started reading science fiction. And I was kind of new to anthologies, but I had discovered Larry Niven in the Isaac Asimov anthology, Where Do We Go From Here? And The World's Best Science Fiction in 1970 has a Larry Niven story in it. Refresh my memory here. It has Death by Ecstasy by Larry Niven. So that's why I bought the book, because it had a Larry Niven story in it, and I really loved Neutron Star in Where Do We Go From Here, and wanted more Larry Niven. I think I had also already read the Collection Convergence series. Little fuzzy on the timing if I read Convergence series before or after buying this book. But anyway, I read Your Haploid Heart way back when I was very young. I read that, and I read a couple other Tiptree stories, in 1978. I was too young. I didn't get it. I didn't get what Tiptree was talking about in her stories back then. Now, I was 13 years old at the time. So I didn't really care for Tiptree, and that actually spoiled me on reading anything by Tiptree until almost the mid-1980s, when Tiptree was publishing in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction and in Isaac Asimov's some stories at that time, which I decided to give a chance, and they absolutely blew me away. The Boy Who Water Skied to Forever, The Only Neat Thing to Do, a number of others that were published into the late 1980s and just were amazing. And so I became a big Tiptree fan by all that. But Your Haploid Heart is one that I read really early, but didn't stick with me because I didn't get it. Being more of an adult story, not really meant for kids. First of all, kind of amazing that, September 1969, this was John W. Campbell bought the story for Analog, which is probably the most conservative, by that time anyway. Campbell and Analog, I think, were the most conservative of all the science fiction magazines. And I believe that remains true to this day, that it stays pretty conservative, very much on the traditional hard science fiction side of things. That doesn't mean that Analog didn't ever publish anything that was remotely experimental or pushed any kind of boundaries. They did from time to time. It's just most of what they published was very traditional, much more so than the other magazines. But Your Haploid Heart appeared in Analog and was purchased by John W. Campbell. So she did have precedent with being an analog, but it's still Tiptree and Tiptree's style, Tiptree's subjects and Tiptree's style really aren't what you think of when you think of analog, and especially not when you think of John W. Campbell. Okay, so it just kind of blows my mind that this was an analog story. It also blows my mind that even though it did make it into the world's best SF for 1970 by Woolheim and Carr, two of the most important editors of the field, and even though it was in Analog, which was the most prominent science fiction magazine at the time, it wasn't nominated for either Hugo or Nebula. Didn't even make it as didn't win, didn't make it as a nominee. I mean, looking at some of the other stories that it was up against, the winner in the short novelette category for 1969, which is when it was published, 1969. The winner in that category was Time Considered as a Helix of Semi-Precious Stones by Samuel R. Delany. Okay, but still, it didn't even make the nominee list. But you also have stories like After the Myths Went Home by Robert Silverberg, Death by Ecstasy by Larry Niven, A Boy and His Dog by Harlan Ellison, Ship of Shadows by Fritz Leiber, Nine Lives by Ursula Le Guin, and The Big Flash by Norman Spinrad. 1969 was an amazing year for very literate science fiction. So Tiptree was up against some really, really big competition for the awards that year. And I think that explains why Your Haploid Heart did not even make it as a nominee. But did it deserve to be a nominee? Sometimes it's unfortunate. There are some stories that just happen in those years when there's so many other really, really great stories published. And so a story that deserves to be better known, a story that deserves to be considered a classic and be given awards, won't get an award and won't even get on the finalist list for nominees because they're just up against such great competition. And then a couple of years later, you'll have an award season where there's just not really anything. Like this year's Hugo's, the list of stories that got nominated, I'm not the only one who looked at it and thought, these stories, I don't know most of them. The ones that I know anything of, I haven't read any of them. The ones that I know anything of, where I've heard something of it, I haven't heard anything especially spectacular about them. And yet here they are, finalists for the Hugo Award. And now, of course, the winners have been announced. Congratulations to the winners. And I don't mean to put down what writers have done in 2022. It just wasn't a very exciting list. There was nothing like Your Haploid Heart on the list. And you get years like that. And so then you get winners of the awards that you read them and you go, wow, they're just not anywhere near as good as the stories that got nominated last year or the year before. And so I think that's kind of what's going on in 1969, why Your Haploid Heart did not get the attention it really deserves, because it deserves a lot of attention. Why does it deserve attention? First, I'll talk about a little bit about what it's about. Set the stage, so to speak. You have a survey team from Earth going to this alien planet. This alien planet wants to join the Federation. It's not exactly like Star Trek, but kind of along those lines, where Earth is one of many worlds that are part of a loose organization that all work together and trade together. And this planet wants in. And they failed to get in once before. They're trying a second time, so an Earth survey team is sent there to find out why, to find out what's going on. And along with this is the fact that a previous Earthman that was sent there to investigate things, a biologist, disappeared. He hasn't been heard from. So this team arrives on this planet and starts investigating and finds out there's the dominant species. There's a dominant and what seems to be a subordinate species on this planet. They're both intelligent, human-like beings. And the one species looks very human and is described as very beautiful. But the other species gets very angry when Earthmen want to learn more about them and start questioning the political situation here, because it looks like this human-seeming species that's the subordinate, it looks like they're actually being like the other species is trying to wipe them out. It looks like there's genocide going on. So the survey team wants to look into this, because definitely if they're committing genocide against other intelligent beings on their own planet, they are not going to be allowed into the Federation. So he's got to find out more. But the one species, I forget the names of the two species, the one species gets really, really upset about this. And apparently the biologist that had been there previously said something to them about what he found out about the biology going on this planet. I need to end the synopsis there, because I start running into some major spoilers, though I do need to kind of touch on some of that in order to talk more about this story. There's some very interesting themes here. So I guess if you don't want the story spoiled, you should probably just go read it. And trust me that this is one of the greatest. Okay, this is a top tale, hands down, no doubt. I even sent a message to Emily that she should read it when she has time, because I think she'll love this story. And remember, this was published in Analog, the most conservative of the science fiction magazines, in September of 1969. And back then, there were still a lot of things that were taboo, to the point where Harlan Ellison invited authors to send him their rejected stories that were rejected for taboo content, and he published Dangerous Visions in 1968. Because there was so much that the publishing industry felt was taboo and could not publish. Could not and would not publish. And the magazines were forced to work under this code as well, especially the science fiction magazines, because it was still mostly considered by the general public as just kid stuff. See, you couldn't have any kind of sex going on in the magazines. So of course, what does Tiptree do? She writes a story about sex. But it's not like a romance novel with steamy sex scenes. Rather, it's an intelligent exploration of alternative biological systems of reproduction. And she says in the story that the people on this planet have a biology that is very similar to what are they called, Medeans or something like that. It's some kind of sea creature that has a very odd reproductive cycle. And the reproductive cycle of these two species on this planet is very much similar. And the two species, it turns out, are dependent on one another in a very interesting way. Which, because it's dealing with reproduction, makes this story breaking taboos, but it does so in a way that's very scientific and very science fictional. And it's packed into a novelette that, yeah, it's a novelette. It's packed into a novelette story that is very well written, excellent characters, tightly woven, great plot, interesting action going on. Just such a brilliantly done story. This story has everything you could possibly want. Taboo themes, science, intelligent ideas, action, good plotting, good characterization. I mean, this has got it all. This has got everything you could possibly ask for in a science fiction story, except that it's not 1,000 pages or 6 volumes long. It doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be any longer than it is. It's perfect the way it is. At some time, I really need to dig back into the other stories, the stories that did get nominated and did win. It's been so many years since I've read all those. I gotta dig back into them as an older adult and try to compare and contrast and see if they really are better than your Haploid Heart, because this blew me away. On the strength of what I've read here, if I were to award Best Story of 1969, I think this would be it. To wrap it up, this is an amazing story. This is highly recommended by me. If you love James Tiptree, you have to read it. Even if you don't really want to do like I'm doing and read everything by James Tiptree, if you just want to read her best stories, you got to include your Haploid Heart. This is way up there on my list. It's just such an excellent story. And of course, anybody else that's interested in science fiction of the 1960s into the 1970s, I think this qualifies as new wave. Anybody that's interested in science fiction by women, anybody that's just interested in more recent, more sophisticated science fiction stories, you should be reading your Haploid Heart. You know, if you just want to avoid the pulp science fiction stuff and avoid the space opera and get to just the more intelligent, more literate ones, your Haploid Heart should be on that list. If you're not a big science fiction fan, no, this is very science fiction. You know, this is really science fiction, where it's about people investigating and discovering a scientific circumstance and how that affects everybody in the story. And that's my definition of science fiction. That's my really tight, limited definition of science fiction. So go read this story. But before you do, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave some kind of comments if you've read it before. If you haven't read it, come back later and leave me your comments. Tell me what you think of it. It's only a novelette. It won't take a lot of your time. Most people will read this in a half hour to 45 minutes, I think. Some people might even be faster than that. It's worth that time. It's well worth that time. And come on back for more James Tiptree. And I'll be here doing the videos.